Okay, we shall continue to look at whether viruses are considered living or non-living. Alright, so in the news or sometimes when we talk among ourselves, we always say, how do we kill the virus, right? During the pandemic, we sanitize our hands to kill the virus. Right, so in order for us to kill the virus, then the virus must be living, right? So let's look at whether this saying, killing the virus, is even sound or not, alright? By looking at whether viruses are living or not. Okay, so most biologists would look at 7 criteria in order for us to decide whether something is living or not. And these 7 criteria are, number 1, whether there is organized structures, order in the structure that is maintained, whether there's the maintenance of a constant internal environment, which is homeostasis, whether the thing that we are looking at is able to respond to stimuli from the environment, whether it is able to pass down genes, which is heredity, right? Whether it is able to respire and in order to acquire energy, and whether it has bodily functions or reactions that utilize energy, okay, whether it's able to reproduce, and whether it is able to evolve and adapt to the environment. So these are the 7 criteria most biologists use, traditionally at least, right, to consider whether something is living or not. And I hope you display all these 7 criteria. All right, so when you don't respond in class and the teachers call you dead, that's biologically correct, yeah? So anyway, right, let's look at whether viruses display these characteristics of life, these criteria. Right, so viruses are non-cellular and they are obligate intracellular parasites. So they must infect cells in order for them to be able to display some of these characteristics. Right, so when they're outside the host cell, when they are not infecting a host cell, they do display some of the characteristics, but not all of them. Right? Some of the characteristics they are not able to display. Okay, so we'll look at some of these, the 7 criteria, and whether viruses display them or not. All right. So for the first one, order, right, organized structures. Right, so viruses do have organized structures so that support the view that they are living, because they have the capsid coat, right? And you have learned before, right, in an earlier video, capsid coat has a particular shape, and that is obviously maintained, okay? And for the enveloped viruses, they have the viral envelope, the structure, the phosphobilayer structure of the viral envelope is maintained, right? So that is supporting the view that viruses are living. Okay, for the homeostasis part, viruses are not cellular, right? There's no cytoplasm. Okay, so there's not really an internal environment. Okay, so if there's no internal environment, there's nothing to maintain. Okay, so they don't exhibit this homeostasis. All right. Then for the third one, they do not have mechanisms for sensing stimuli or responding to such stimuli. Right, so that does not support them being living. Right. However, right, when they are inside the host cells, right? Later you will learn for bacteriophage, right? Especially, and HIV as well. They do respond. So the cell, the infected cell, would respond to the external stimuli, which will trigger the reproduction of the virus. So in a sense, the virus respond to external stimuli when they are inside or when they have infected the host cell. Okay, so that is like supporting the fact that they are living when they are inside the host cells. For the heredity, right, obviously all viruses contain nucleic acid, viral genome, which can be passed down when the viruses reproduce, when they infect the host cells, right? So that is a living characteristic. For number 5, viruses are not able to make energy or make ATP as a form of energy. However, they are able to use the energy of the host cells, right, for reproduction. So they are able to utilize ATP that is made by the host cells when they have infected the host cells. Okay? And viruses, some of them do contain enzymes involved in replication of nucleic acid. Okay, so this is a living characteristics. So the fact that there are these enzymes point to the fact that they can reproduce, right? So therefore, it is a living characteristics. However, right, they are not able to make the nucleic acids proteins on its own, right? So even though some of the viruses have the enzymes, they don't have the raw materials on their own, right? There's no nucleotides for them to add together, right, to form the nucleic acid, right? So on their own, they are not able to reproduce. But when they have infected the host cells, they can make use of the resources of the host cells and some of the other enzymes and mechanisms as well to make the viral components in order to make new viruses for reproduction. So when they have infected the host cells, they are able to reproduce, right? And for evolution, right, we will see that there are quite a number of, the rate of mutations in viruses is actually quite fast, right? So that leads to evolution, right? So that would be a living characteristics, all right? So what we can see is that viruses do display some of the criteria of life on their own, and they can display even more when they have infected a host cells. However, there are some that they really do not display at all. Example would be the homeostasis one. They really don't have an internal environment. All right, so do we then therefore consider viruses living or not? I mean, they display some of them, some of the criteria, right, but not all. Right, so do we really how do we conclude, right, basically, right? How do we conclude whether the viruses are living or not? All right, so I'm not going to give you a conclusion. I'll leave you to do the conclusion yourself. The learning outcome, in terms of my teaching, right, for the syllabus, the learning outcome says discuss, right? So you need to know how to, well, support and also not support, right, depending on what the question is asking for. All right, so I'll leave you out of your own interest and judgment to decide whether viruses are living or not. My job is to get you to be able to describe and explain both, whether it's living or non-living, right? So if you decide that viruses are living, then continue to say things like killing the virus, okay? But if you are, well, like me, deciding that viruses are probably not living, then don't say killing viruses lah. Yeah, so I would never say that. I would never say kill virus. Yeah, and most I would say break down and destroy the structure, for example. Okay, all right. But then, now, because the learning outcome, if you look at the learning outcome again, right? Besides whether viruses are living, there's another part to the learning outcome, which is whether viruses or how viruses challenge the cell theory. Okay, so assuming viruses are living, right, it will challenge the cell theory, because if you recall the cell theory that you learned, right, first lecture of the year, there are 3 principles to it. They are that all living organisms are composed of cells, and the cell is the smallest and most basic unit of life, and cells grow from pre-existing cells. So these are the 3 principles of the cell theory. So if we consider viruses to be living, right, then your living organisms, not all of them would be composed of cells, right? Because viruses, if they are living organisms, but they are not cellular, right? They are not composed of cells, right? So this principle is no longer valid. And if viruses are living, and they are smaller and even more basic, more simple, right, than cells, then your cells are no longer the smallest and most basic unit of life, if viruses are living, right? And viruses do not undergo cell division, right? So viruses do not grow, right, so a virus do not grow into 2. right? A virus will have to infect a whole cells, and within the whole cell, it will reproduce and replicate. Right? So it's not the same as how cells divide. So a pre-existing parent cell divide to give two daughter cells. Yep. Okay. So the cell theory would no longer be valid if viruses are living. Right? But if viruses are not living, then it doesn't matter, right? Then the cells is still going to be the most basic. The cell is still, or other living organisms are still going to be composed of cells, and so on. Right? So the cell theory is challenged when we consider viruses to be living. So do you see, back to the syllabus, yeah? Do you see why this learning outcome contains two things, right? Because they are very much linked. You need to be able to explain or support the view that viruses are living or can be considered living, which will then challenge the cell theory. Right, so it's like linked together, and that's why it's all written in one learning outcome. All right? Okay.